In the early 2000s, I was teaching fourth grade English at an exclusive Catholic academy in an affluent suburb on the outskirts of a major city. The academy was quite small, perhaps 20 to 30 students per class, and never more than 2 classes per grade level. It wasn't the kind of place most people were aware of unless you had the wealth or the right connections to get your child enrolled. The student body was minuscule, like I said, with at most 60 kids in a grade, but typically not even that many. Nearly all of them were from wealthy families. Not always the same kind of wealth, though, which was something I picked up on fairly quickly. Some of the kids had that old money refinement, as if they'd been taught to shake hands at formal events since kindergarten. They were well-mannered and respectful, sort of how you'd imagine the children of diplomats to act. Those kids were very keen to learn, and because of that, they were also simple to teach. Others, though, you could tell their parents were just throwing cash at every problem, hoping tuition might solve whatever was happening at home. But if there was one thing they all had in common, it was intelligence. The academy was too selective to let anyone just slide by, so that certainly made my work a lot simpler. Anyway, all the students called me Miss G. I wasn't married then, and frankly, even if I had been, I probably would have still gone by that. Over my time there, I had my fair share of challenging students. Most teachers in private academies do, even if people prefer to pretend otherwise. But there was one student in particular who stood out to me more than any other. His name was Leo, and while a lot of the kids had behavioral oddities you could attribute to being spoiled or overstimulated, Leo was different. There was something about the way he behaved that didn't quite fit the usual mold. Not even for a dysfunctional, wealthy kid. Leo always had this massive gray binder with him, stuffed with nothing but loose-leaf sheets. He was obsessed with writing, constantly mentioning the novel he was creating, even though he would never tell anyone what it was about. And to be fair, he was talented, easily the best writer in my class, maybe in the entire grade. His vocabulary was advanced, and his imagery was surprisingly vivid for a fourth grader. Usually, kids that young just haven't experienced enough of the world to describe it in such detail. But it was second nature to him. It was the kind of raw talent you couldn't teach. But Leo had trouble socially. He didn't really form bonds with the other kids. Either he didn't want to, or they just couldn't figure him out. He ended up in the principal's office more than once that year. There was one incident that still sticks in my mind, though I'm sure I could recall more if I truly tried. One day, he told a classmate he brought a knife to school. It created quite a scene, and he came perilously close to expulsion. But when they checked his belongings, there was no knife. The only reason I knew all the details is because one of my students' parents and I were quite close, and she told me everything. It was rumored that he actually did have a knife that day, but had hidden it before his things were searched. No one ever found it though, so they had no option but to say he just lied about the whole thing. After a while, I started observing a strange pattern in Leo's work. On his quizzes and short-form answers, he'd add question marks to the end of perfectly clear statements. Not in a "maybe I'm incorrect" way, but more like he was questioning facts that shouldn't be questioned. For instance, instead of writing, "The protagonist is the narrator," he'd write, "The protagonist is the narrator." It was especially perplexing because I'd been his teacher long enough to know he definitely understood the material. It kept occurring, not just once or twice. It became more frequent. Eventually, the question marks began appearing in other places. Any white space on a page was fair game for him. I remember at its peak, one of his quizzes was more question mark than text. He started writing question marks on small scraps of paper and leaving them around my classroom, as if he was trying to torment me specifically. At one point, I couldn't overlook it any longer, so I told him to stay after class. Avoiding sounding too worried or annoyed, I asked him about it gently. Part of me thought he was trying to communicate something to me without saying it outright, so I didn't want to frighten him. His parents never came to parent-teacher conferences, so I thought there was a chance he was trying to tell me something about his home life. I remember how still he became when I brought it up, like he was shocked. He wouldn't give me a direct answer. The most I got out of him was a vague statement about how unsure he had been about a lot of things. I didn't really know what that meant, but it didn't seem like he was going to offer anything more, so I let him leave. I'm probably understating how strange the situation was. Even now, in all my years of teaching, I've never experienced anything more unsettling. It blows every disciplinary issue I've ever handled out of the water. Sometime after that conversation, it must have been mid-May by then, I heard about an incident that made everything else feel insignificant by comparison. Leo had gotten into a fight with a 6th grader named Kyle during recess. From what I was told, Kyle had been bothering Leo for a while. Nothing new, sadly. But that day, things escalated. Apparently, Kyle snatched Leo's binder out of his hands and started taunting him, saying he was going to read his little novel out loud. Leo went berserk and completely snapped. He lunged at Kyle and raked his nails across his face with both hands. Not punched. He literally clawed him. Staff had to physically pull him off. Kyle ended up in the hospital. I saw a photo of the injuries later, and I'll never forget how deep those gashes were. It looked like something that had been caused by a feral animal. Leo was expelled after that. I obviously wasn't involved in the process, but I did notice something peculiar. Leo's parents never showed up. Not once. I don't even think they picked him up. There was always this strange mystery around them, like they wanted to remain invisible. Like I said, I'd never seen them at a parent-teacher conference, ever. And even after such a high-profile incident, it still felt like they didn't exist. Apparently, everything had been managed over email, and that was that. I never saw Leo again. But the story doesn't conclude there. A few weeks after Leo was expelled, I started finding those little scraps of paper again, the ones with the question marks. At first, I told myself I must have just missed a few from before, that maybe I hadn't cleaned up as meticulously as I thought. But it kept happening, and they looked fresh too, which terrified me. I told the administration, and they said they'd try to handle the situation. But that didn't calm my nerves at all. I started locking my classroom door after hours, even though no one else did. And still, I'd come in some mornings and find new scraps of paper waiting. There were no cameras in the classroom, no real way to know for sure, but I became convinced that Leo had been sneaking back in. I talked to my mom about it one night over dinner, and I think that was the moment I realized how on edge I'd become. And I knew just how crazy this was driving me when I started having nightmares about the incident. I had a dream one night that I found a scrap with a question mark on my front doorstep. After this, I started losing sleep. I was starting to dread even walking into the building, so when summer finally arrived, I informed the administration that I would not be returning. That was the end of it. Leo never showed up at my house or followed me or did anything else I would have had to report. Part of me feels a little guilty that I didn't inform anyone about the situation sooner. But until that fight, I hadn't thought it was worth making a huge deal over. Sometimes I wonder about him, about what kind of person he grew up to be. There was definitely something wrong with that boy. I hope he got the help he needed.